Recently, the Resident Evil series has been going strength to strength. Heck, they even remade a pretty much perfect game, and somehow they didn't mess it up. Regardless of how the actual series is going though, indies are out there making really unique takes on the beloved Resident Evil formula. And I'll just say right here, there are games like Crow Country and Signalis, which are such obvious send-ups and homages. You really gotta check those out. I'm not going to include them in this video here where I recommend a bunch of other games that are Resident Evil-y, but definitely check those ones out. Those just seem too obvious to include here. That said, I know that Resident Evil has some fans that can be pretty dogmatic about what has to be there to be considered a Resident Evil clone. I'm not really interested in delving into all that and sticking super strictly to that formula. All I'm really going to be doing here is recommending some games that I think have some elements that can be really appreciated by fans of Resident Evil. Whether that be them sticking strictly to the Resident Evil formula, or just taking some elements here and there, I think that these games all offer something that a Resident Evil fan can appreciate. Also, I'm going to be going over a bunch of games that are already out, and then later on getting into stuff that's going to be coming out into the future, so make sure you stick around if you want to see some stuff that is on the horizon. It looks pretty cool. With all that said, I'm going to get into the very first one here, which is the one that sticks mostly to the Resident Evil formula, and that is You Will Die Here Tonight. Obviously, if you look at any second of gameplay from this game, it's very Resident Evil. Very Resident Evil 1 specifically. And they lean into that quite a bit, but they play off of that expectation and kind of manipulate you in certain ways with the storytelling because it goes different directions from what you expect. That said though, the gameplay here reminds me a lot of Resident Evil Gaiden, which was the Game Boy Resident Evil game where you walk around and then when you get into combat, it becomes like a first-person-ish timing thing. It's kind of similar to that in this game where when you get into combat, it actually goes into a first-person shooting mode where you're doing a shooting gallery like a House of the Dead sort of combat experience. And it's really unique and cool in that way. Other than that stuff, the really unique selling point here is that in You Will Die Here Tonight, once you die, you are dead. That character's dead in the story, and then you play as another member of what is pretty much the STARS team, and you pick up the progress that they left behind. Some of the objectives and things will already be completed by the character that you played as before. I think this is a really great one if you're looking for a game that's super faithful to Resident Evil while still doing some pretty unique, interesting concepts. So make sure you check that one out if you're looking for a pretty faithful experience. The next one up here is the Tartarus Key. I really like the way this game looks a lot, but it's a first-person escape room-y kind of game. It basically surrounds you and a bunch of other characters in basically a Saw-like situation where you're trapped in these little rooms and you have to solve these puzzles to escape, and it has a pretty big ensemble. This one I recommend if you're just a fan of the Resident Evil-like puzzles, so check out the Tartarus Key if you're into that. The next one up here is Saturnalia, which is basically style over everything for this game. It has this cool sketchbook presentation, but this is another one that I recommend if you're not really looking for combat. You play as 4 different characters in this game, and the horror element is that sometimes there's a monster that will show up and it will chase you, sort of like an amnesia situation. But also, this game is set in a randomly generated map. It's a sort of roguelike experience, but it's not too long, and I really recommend this one if you're looking for something with a lot of unique style to it. The next one we have here is Evil Tonight, which is basically a sprite-based Resident Evil game. It's pretty neat. It has really great art and attention to detail that you don't see in a lot of games that are sprite-based like this, but this one, unlike the last few games, actually does have combat in it too. It's pretty much everything you would expect from Resident Evil in a game that just happens to be sprite-based. I do recommend though that if you do choose to play this one, maybe play it on easy, because on the balanced and harder difficulties, the enemies can be a little bit spongy and the resources are pretty sparse, but this one I think is an easy recommendation if you're looking for something with a really cool style to it that just happens to, also be Resident Evil. Next one up here is another game that is just the puzzles, but it's a brand new game actually, called Lorelei with the Laser Eyes, and this game is just so cool. It basically has the style of like a Suda51, Killer 7 kind of thing, but it's also like a fixed camera Resident Evil puzzle game. Basically, you're set off into this big mansion and you have to solve all of these disparate puzzles, and it's really incredible because the puzzles are so complex and it's just something you're not going to really get anywhere else. I will say though that this is not really a bingey kind of game. This is a game where you definitely need to get like a real life physical notebook and write down the things that you're going through and work out a lot of the puzzles. It's not really bingeable in that way, where some of the puzzles are tough enough where you'll kind of get stuck and you should walk away. You really don't want to force yourself through this game. It's more of a vibe kind of game, and you really don't want to ruin that by getting frustrated. So I really recommend taking your time with this one. The next one up here is a little bit more kid-friendly compared to a lot of the other games in this video, but it's called Gylt, and it has like a Paranorman monster house kind of vibe mixed with like the evil within. Most of the game has this stealth focus to it, and it also has this flashlight mechanic that you are probably familiar with from games like Alan Wake, where you can use a flashlight to dispel the darkness enemies. But this is a really cool one if you want to play something a little lighter, but it still has the fundamentals that you're looking for out of a game like Resident Evil. The next one here is a sequel to a game that was majorly popular, and that is Save Room the Merchant. The original Save Room was really big, and this one seems like it's kind of gone under the radar. Just like the original Save Room, it pretty much takes the Resident Evil 4 inventory system and makes it into a puzzle game, but here it really builds on the Resident Evil 4-ness, where it adds in like the codec kind of conversations that you had in Resident Evil 4, and it also adds in the merchant element where you're buying items to meet item requirements for each of the puzzles. I would say that this one is a little bit more difficult than the original Save Room, but I think that the presentation upgrades here alone make this one worth taking a look at. Alright, and then for the final game that is already out that I want to talk about is My Friendly Neighborhood. It's a mascot horror game, and I know a lot of those get a bad rap, and I'm not a huge fan of them myself, but My Friendly Neighborhood really surprised me. It's basically a modern Resident Evil style game, like RE7 or RE8, where it's a first-person Resident Evil game, and this has all of the elements. It just happens to be set in a Jim Henson style puppet production studio, and it's really charming, and I really enjoyed my time with this one. Alright, first game up that is not out yet that I just want to cover and make sure you're aware of and maybe add to your wish list would be Compound Fracture. I know you might be looking at this and being like, okay, this looks very Dino Crisis, and it does. It looks a lot like Dino Crisis, and the crossover between Dino Crisis and Resident Evil I think is fair enough that I can include it on this video. Basically, looking at the Steam page for this one, it pretty much promises just to be exactly what you would expect out of a game that looks like this, so make sure you check that one out if you're dying for more Dino Crisis. Then we got Echoes of the Living, which looks to be just incredibly faithful to Resident Evil 2 specifically. Yeah, make sure you check that one out if you want another game that's super faithful to what has come before. Then there is Enigma of Fear, which looks to be a lot like Resident Evil, and then there's also a dog here, so I feel like whenever there's a dog present in a survival horror game, you just want to say Haunting Ground, because dog. But also, it has a really cool sprite-based art style to it in a 3D environment, and I really like the look of it. Next one up here is one that I've been keeping an eye on for quite a while, and that is Heartworm. This one is another throwback survival horror game. This one looks a little bit maybe more on the Silent Hill side of the Resident Evil survival horror dichotomy, but this one also does have a cool photo taking element which could add a little bit of Fatal Frame into that stew that is going, I guess. Regardless, this is one that I've been keeping an eye on for a while, and I think this could be a really cool one. Then we have Hollowbody, which is another game that's trying to stick to the Resident Evil, Silent Hill, fixed cameras type of survival horror, but I think this one is probably going after more of a later stage Resident Evil, not quite Resident Evil 4, but not really Resident Evil 2. I'd say more Dreamcast era Resident Evil. Code Veronica and maybe Silent Hill 2 is kind of the vibe I'm getting off of this one here. And then last game I want to mention here is one that is like mind-blowing the first time you see its main kind of gimmick, and that is Holstin. It has a really amazing camera situation where you're in this pulled back third-person perspective, and then once you go into combat, the camera pulls down from this bird's eye view into this third-person shooting that is just incredibly impressive the first time you see it. I hope that this one turns out to be as good as everyone kind of hopes it is, because it really looks incredible. Alright, and that's going to be my video on games that I think Resident Evil fans should check out. I hope you liked the video. If you did, like, subscribe, do all the YouTube-y stuff. That'd be super cool. If you did, I'd actually really appreciate that. But yeah, thanks for watching. Thanks for watching. Thank you for watching. Thank you for watching. Thank you for watching.